An ordinary high street in an ordinary town in the middle of the day. Mongrel Mob in red against their arch foe, the black.
And armed officers swooped on this street, Sam. It is a known street for its Mongrel Mob connections.
The Mongrel Mob have been doing good deeds in the community way before I was born.
Wanting a more compassionate and tolerant and caring society, something that I want too. But I ask the question, why am I reading in the papers that your members are still selling meth?
Hurrah, 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 hurrah! Mongrel Mob! Keep it around! Keep it around!
The origins of the Mongrel Mob began in the 1960s within the twin cities of Napier and Hastings on New Zealand's North Island. After the Second World War had finished and the economic boom began to slow down, a generation of young men started to find themselves adrift. Primarily white New Zealand Europeans, known locally as bodgies or widgies, rebellious youths who were influenced by American counterculture, started to pop up, congregating in milk bars and public spaces. The spawn of a loose collective into a named entity is widely attributed to a specific interaction in the Hastings Magistrates Court, now known as the Hastings District Court. In a case documented around the year of 1966 or 1967, a group of these youths appeared before a magistrate facing charges related to minor disorderly behavior. Looking down at the disheveled, defiant group in the dock, the judge reportedly denounced them as nothing more than a pack of mongrels. While modern historians often view this story as apocryphal, a popular myth without a verified court transcript, the legend remains a cornerstone of the gang's history. Another version of the story claims it was two Maori brothers being sentenced, but regardless of which version is true, the impact was still total. Rather than shrinking from the label, the youths embraced it as a badge of honor. It was a perfect articulation of their perceived status in society: unwanted, mixed breed, and dangerous. They began referring to themselves as the Mongrels, later adding mob to solidify their group identity. In these fledgling years, they were not the organized criminal syndicate recognized today. They were a loose affiliation of marginalized young men, bound by geography, shared alienation, and a fondness for antisocial behavior. But while the name was now established, the demographic of the mighty nation was about to undergo a radical transformation that would redefine the gang forever. As the 1960s meshed into the 1970s, the demographic profile of the Mongrel Mob began to shift dramatically, reflecting the broader shifts in New Zealand society at the time. The post-war era had triggered one of the fastest urban migrations of an indigenous population ever recorded. Between 1945 and 1975, Maori moved from traditional rural settlements to the cities in search of work. Around the same time, there was a parallel wave of migration from Pacific Island nations, encouraged by the government to fill labor shortages. Thousands of families from Samoa, Tonga, and the Cook Islands arrived to work in factories in the cities of Auckland and Wellington. Many Maori and Pacific youth, often struggling within an education system that did not cater to them and facing overt and systemic racism, found themselves on the margins of city life. This was particularly true for those who had passed through the state care system, with institutions like the notorious Corhier Terry Boys Training Center or the Ho'okario Beach Boys Home becoming prime incubators for the gang. Disaffected youth from across the country forged bonds in the face of institutional abuse, now including white, Maori, and Pacifica. By the mid-1970s, what had begun as a predominantly white street gang had transformed into a predominantly Maori and Pacific organization, one that had exchanged milk bars for a rigid, militaristic hierarchy. The gang provided what mainstream society couldn't: a sense of belonging, protection, and a distinct, albeit fearsome, identity. They adopted the color red, which would later largely distinguish themselves from their emerging rivals, the Black Power, who formed in Wellington around the same time. The rivalry between the Reds and the Blacks would become the defining conflict of the New Zealand gang landscape for decades, spilling blood on streets from Auckland to Invercargill. Throughout the late 1970s and 1980s, New Zealand police and social agencies struggled to comprehend the evolving threat. Initially treated as a public order issue, authorities soon realized they were facing a hardening, increasingly structured organization. The prison system played a pivotal role in this evolution. As mob members were incarcerated for escalating crimes of violence and robbery, prisons, still very true to this day, transformed into recruitment centers and networking hubs. Like many gangs, the concept of chapters based on regions became entrenched, each led by a president, supported by a vice president, and a sergeant at arms responsible for internal discipline. It was during this era that the mob's most shocking iconography was adopted. In a calculated effort to repulse mainstream society and project absolute rebellion, members began using Nazi imagery, including swastikas and the phrase "Sieg Heil," as a greeting. The Mongrel Mob was not alone in this provocative display. Another emerging group, called the Stormtroopers, leaned into the same dark aesthetic. In a landmark 1970 television interview, members of the Stormtroopers were questioned on why they wore the swastika. Their response mirrored the mob's own philosophy. It was a tool designed specifically to goad and repulse a respectable society that viewed them as second-class citizens. Anthropologists and gang experts agree, this was rarely born of genuine Nazi support, but used to terrify the white-dominated public and societal norms. The bulldog emblem, most notoriously wearing the German helmet, became the dominant patch, a sacred object to be defended with lethal force. While the 80s were defined by street-level conflict, the 1990s saw the Mongrel Mob become a permanent, institutionalized part of the New Zealand landscape. This was the decade of the gang fortress. Across the country, chapters began turning residential houses into highly fortified compounds, complete with massive corrugated iron fences, surveillance cameras, and 24-hour sentries. These pads weren't just homes, they were symbols of the gang's regional sovereignty. During this time, the mob also began to explore the business of crime more seriously. They moved away from disorganized petty theft and into the large-scale cultivation and distribution of cannabis, which provided the capital and the infrastructure for what was coming next. Although methamphetamine first surfaced in the late 80s, it wasn't until the late 1990s that its use truly exploded. Local cooks discovered they could manufacture high-quality meth using pseudoephedrine, an over-the-counter ingredient in common cold and flu medicines. This allowed for makeshift labs to pop up in kitchens and garages across the country. For the Mongrel Mob, this was a turning point that would change the gang's trajectory. The lucrative nature of the meth trade meant that the comparatively quiet business of the late 90s was now a high-stakes criminal industry by the early 2000s. The warrior image of the 70s, defined by street brawls and physical intimidation, was being replaced by the organized criminal. The mob realized that the millions of dollars generated by the meth trade brought a level of power and influence that traditional violence never could. By the early 2000s, the meth trade had become so pervasive that New Zealand police launched a landmark investigation that would set the blueprint for the next 2 decades, Operation Crusade. The primary target was the Aotearoa chapter, led at the time by President Joseph Waringi. This aggressive new faction had set up shop in the Christchurch suburb of Phillipstown. Their headquarters on Wilson's Road wasn't just a rendezvous, it was a 24-hour drug supermarket. Sitting in the literal shadow of Jade Stadium, the home of the city's beloved Crusaders rugby team, its location was a statement of pure disregard. While thousands of families flocked to the stadium every weekend to watch the games, a constant stream of drug traffic flowed through the fortified gates just down the street. After 15 months of intense surveillance and the interception of over 100,000 communications, the crackdown was total. From a 2026 perspective, the scale of the data might seem modest compared to global stings, but at the time, it was the largest criminal trial New Zealand had ever seen. Waringi and 17 others were forced to answer to a single jury simultaneously, standing in a dock that had to be specially managed for the scale of the group. The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning 15 guilty verdicts on dozens of charges, ranging from drug dealing to hoarding guns and ammunition. Waringi himself was ultimately sentenced to 13 years in prison, but the most enduring images of the crackdown didn't happen in the courtroom. As Justice Graham Pankhurst was entering the convictions, the gang's fortress was being systematically torn down by bulldozers. The front wall of the villa was demolished, exposing an interior decorated with massive mob artwork. It was a clear signal from the state, though gang compounds still currently exist. The era of the untouchable gang compound was over. As the 2010s progressed, the mighty nation moved further away from a centralized power structure and into a model of highly profitable regional franchises. Utilizing their rural origins, the mob's methamphetamine networks had taken root in the heart of small-town New Zealand. The key to this expansion was a shift in manufacturing, as early labs were often makeshift setups in residential properties. The 2010s saw the rise of the rural clan lab. These remote sites allowed for larger-scale production with less risk. The telltale chemical odors of a cook, often compared to the scent of ammonia or window cleaner, were easily masked by the open air. The labs, protected by the landscape itself and surrounded by lookouts and rugged terrain, made it nearly impossible for police to raid without significant advanced warning. This era of rural dominance was eventually challenged by 2 massive police strikes that revealed just how deep the franchise model had gone. In 2017, police launched Operation Walnut, exposing a sophisticated wholesale ring moving 1 kilo of meth into the Wellington region every week. A year later, Operation Notice uncovered a total community takeover in the rural Bay of Plenty. The Carwero Mongrel Mob kingdom had become so entrenched they essentially dictated the town's social life. Asserting their role as the region's apex syndicate, they ran a local tax on other dealers and operated a round table of directors that functioned more like a corporate board than a street gang. These two operations cemented the gang's evolution. They were no longer just pub brawlers and street fighters. They were a structured criminal franchise. But while the mob was busy consolidating its hold on the provinces, a new breed of criminal was being forged across the Tasman. In late 2014, Australia's Section 501 deportation policy began sending thousands of New Zealand citizens back to the country's shores. Many had lived in Australia since they were toddlers. They arrived with Australian accents, no family ties, and a highly sophisticated corporate approach to crime. Among them were senior members of Australia's most notorious motorcycle clubs, including the Comancheros and the Mongols. Police quickly dubbed them the Nike Bikies, men who traded denim vests for designer brands, fresh haircuts, and gold-plated Harley-Davidson motorcycles. They brought international cartel connections from Southeast Asia and Mexico, flooding the New Zealand market with high-grade drugs at prices the locals couldn't match. Along with operational efficiency and Louis Vuitton bags, the 501s brought an alarming propensity to use violence. New Zealand had seen gang violence before, but not with the same regularity of gunfire. Firearms were already normalized within many Australian gangs, and when that culture landed here, it came with no hesitation. They would either patch over local gangs or simply shoot to kill, a philosophy that mirrored Colombian drug lord Pablo Escobar's favorite phrase, plata o plomo, translation, silver or lead. You either took their money and joined them, or you took a bullet. This money or blood approach was a direct challenge to the mob's regional sovereignty. An identity crisis began to crystallize. To compete for recruits and market share, the mighty nation had to modernize. The rough, rugged image of the 80s started to fade, and in its place emerged a swankier mob member. Heavily tattooed, physically elite, and active on social media, this pressure to appear more professional and less antisocial set the stage for the most controversial chapter in the gang's history, the rise of the Waikato Kingdom, and their public attempt to trade the Sieg Heil for social legitimacy. On one side, the gold-plated gangs were stealing their prestige and recruits. On the other, a series of high-profile shootings had turned public opinion into a weapon for the government. The Waikato Kingdom chapter, led by Sonny Fatu, made moves that would polarize the country. They realized that in the modern era, territory wasn't just won on the street, it was won in the media. In a radical departure from 60 years of tradition, spurred by the 2019 Christchurch mosque shootings, the kingdom publicly announced they were distancing themselves from Nazi imagery and would replace the Sieg Effin Heil cry with simply Mongrel Mob. Following the terror attacks, gang members famously stood guard outside local mosques during Friday prayers, offering protection and a symbol of unity. The kingdom continued to make national headlines for community service and food drives, even suiting up in PPE to help with testing during the COVID-19 outbreak. But simultaneously, members were being targeted in operations like Operation Anom, where the FBI and NZ police intercepted encrypted messages, revealing continued large-scale methamphetamine distribution. In the midst of this transformation, the figure of Harry Tam has been a central point of relation for the gang's public and political identity for years. A lifetime member and former senior public servant, Tam acts as a high-profile liaison between the gang and the government. Tam reframed the conversation around the mighty nation, arguing that the gang was a direct byproduct of the trauma experienced in the state-run boys' homes. Through his consultancy, Hard to Reach, he advocated for the gang members to be viewed as survivors of state neglect, rather than just criminals. His relation to the movement became a national flashpoint in 2021, when the government awarded $2.7 million in seized criminal funds to a mob-led drug rehab initiative. For Tam, it was a breakthrough in Maori-led solutions. For critics, it was the ultimate irony. The state was effectively refunding the gang with the proceeds of their own crimes. The PR war reached its limit in November 2024 when the government passed the Gangs Act, officially banning the public display of gang insignia. In Hastings, just 3 minutes after the law took effect, a man was stopped for displaying a Mongrel Mob sign on his dashboard. By late 2025, over 850 charges had been filed under the new legislation and nearly 200 patches had been seized across the country. But the ban has a visible loophole: tattoos. Unsurprisingly, the crackdown has resulted in a surge of gang-related ink as members move their allegiance from their jackets to their skin, where the state cannot legally reach. As we move through 2026, gang patches are still seen in public, perhaps not as prevalent as before, but the question remains, is that a good thing? The Mongrel Mob has simply adapted. They've traded the leather vests for civilian clothes, the public brawls for international supply lines, and the Sieg Heil for sophisticated legal advocacy. They have spent 60 years evolving to survive every crackdown the state has thrown at them. From the boys' homes of the 60s to the patch ban of 2024, the mob remains a defining and notoriously dangerous force in the landscape of New Zealand crime and its culture in general. What are your thoughts on the ban on gang insignia, and does the rise in gang tattoos make the ban itself irrelevant? What are your thoughts on New Zealand gangs in 2026, our international players, effectively sidelining homegrown chapters? Share your perspectives in the comments below. If you found this documentary informative, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more in-depth explorations of often overlooked, lesser-known stories. Who else would you like to see us detail next? Your engagement helps us continue to shed light on otherwise unheard narratives.